Hello, this is James Camp from Lee College. Welcome to my presentation on the autonomic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system is one of two motor systems of the body, the other one being the somatic motor system. So our first activity today is to list the functions and divisions of the autonomic nervous system. The second is to compare and contrast it with that other motor system, the somatic motor system, which you have already learned about in the section on the skeletal muscles. And the third is to compare and contrast the two divisions of the autonomic nervous system known as sympathetic and parasympathetic. Contrary to its name, the autonomic nervous system is not a completely separate part of the nervous system the way the peripheral nervous system and central nervous systems are. The autonomic nervous system is a part of the peripheral nervous system, and in fact it's one of the two efferent systems that we have. So perhaps the best way to figure out where the peripheral nervous system fits in the information that you already know about the peripheral nervous system is to diagram the flow of information. Now, what we understand most consciously about our peripheral nervous system, the part we're most aware of, is when we consciously sense the outside world. That information flows through the somatic nervous system, or the somatic sensory system, which is one of our two sensory systems in the body. Sensory or afferent is the other way to say that. But there's another part of our afferent nervous system, and that is the way that we unconsciously sense our inside world. What do I mean by that? Well, we're not consciously aware of what our blood pressure is at any given moment, or how much oxygen is in our blood, or even necessarily what parts of our intestines are full of food. But our brain has to keep track of those things all the time. So there are visceral senses that are present in the body as well that provide a flow of information as the visceral sensory system. All of that information flows in to our central nervous system, which collects it and decides how to respond, if at all a response is necessary. If a response is necessary, the central nervous system can respond by sending information out through one of our two motor or efferent systems. The two motor systems are also differentiated by whether we're consciously aware of them or not, though in this case it's more a matter of whether we're consciously in control of them. What are we consciously in control of in our bodies? We're consciously in control of our skeletal muscles. We can move our skeletal muscles whenever we want. So in parallel with the naming of the sensory systems, this is known as somatic motor. You've already learned about how the somatic motor system works when you learned about neuromuscular integration in the muscular system, how a motor neuron goes from the spinal cord, for example, all the way to the muscle of interest. It branches into several telodendria, each of which stimulate one muscle fiber to move under conscious control. But there are also parts of our motor system that regulate things we don't have conscious control over. Nobody walks outside and says, "It's hot outside, I think I need to sweat now." It just happens automatically. And so there's a branch of our nervous system called the autonomic motor system, or autonomic nervous system. And the purpose of the autonomic nervous system is to unconsciously upregulate or downregulate certain body processes that need to be controlled automatically, as it were. So to summarize, somatic motor stimulates skeletal muscle. Those are the muscles that we've already talked about in the muscular system chapter. So there are three other things that the body needs to control. Somatic motor always stimulates a muscle. A muscle relaxes when it's not stimulated and contracts when it is stimulated. But the other three things that we need to control in the body, which are smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and the various glands of the body, those need to either be stimulated or inhibited. Sometimes we need the cardiac muscle to keep beating, but we may need to inhibit it. We may need to slow it down a little bit. So that is what our autonomic motor system does, is it stimulates or inhibits smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glandular secretions. So there are a few functions that the autonomic nervous system has to do. We regulate organ systems that we don't consciously control, which is almost all of them. The only one we're in conscious control of is our muscular system. So one of the things that is most obvious about regulating our organ systems is we have to maintain homeostasis. That is, at most times, we need an internal environment within normal limits. So maintaining homeostasis might mean keeping the heart rate between 70 and 90 beats per minute, which are fairly normal limits. But if we're going jogging, we don't want homeostasis of our heart rate. We want our heart rate to keep up with our body's needs. So we need to adjust it. So the other role of the autonomic nervous system is to adjust operation of certain systems to meet changing needs, especially needs associated with stress. The other thing that the autonomic nervous system does is it keeps key body variables under control. So some examples of autonomic nervous systems, of variables that the autonomic nervous system controls, are heart rate, blood pressure, which is done by blood vessel constriction or dilation. If that doesn't make sense to you, imagine that if you constrict a blood vessel, you're sort of squeezing on the blood inside the blood vessel, and so in a way you're pressurizing that fluid. So constricting the blood vessels will increase blood pressure. Dilating the blood vessels will decrease blood pressure. How efficient our respiration is via what we call bronchodilation or bronchoconstriction. The bronchi are the main airways into and out of the lungs, and so constricting them reduces airflow, dilating them increases airflow. You can imagine that when we're under stress and need more air, we want to dilate our airways. Body temperature is another key variable that is regulated through the autonomic nervous system by things such as hair erection. Remember, that's a smooth muscle activity, sweat glands, and then constriction or dilation of the dermal blood vessels. Rates of digestion, rates of urine production. One thing that we don't normally think of as a response to stress, for example, or as a homeostatic thing, is changing the pupils and lenses of our eyes to help us see what we need to see. Now, if we're running from a bear in the woods, we probably want to look far ahead. That's not the time to be sitting there reading your trail guide. So we'd want to dilate our pupils and look far away. But if we are relaxed and able to sit and read the trail guide, we might need to constrict our pupils and focus our eyes close to us. So that's something that is autonomically regulated as well. Pupil dilation and lens focus. And then finally, something that most people don't think of as an automatic function. We like to think that this is something we have conscious control over, but that would be a complete fiction. The autonomic nervous system regulates sex. Our sexual responses to another person or a situation that we're in are completely out of our conscious control. It's all a series of autonomic reflexes that take place in the base of our spine. Okay, so if the autonomic nervous system has all of these these diverse duties, if it's got to sometimes maintain homeostasis and sometimes adjust for dealing with stress, if it's got to sometimes upregulate a system's activity and sometimes downregulate it, you may have come to the conclusion already that we need two portions of the autonomic nervous system. And those are known as the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. The sympathetic nervous system is our stress response branch. It is also known as the fight or flight division. I think of it sometimes as the running from a bear in the woods division, or the rescuing your toddler from an oncoming car division. It's activated in those kinds of emergency or stressful situations, and its job is to put the body on high alert, to get your brain's attention focused very narrowly on the current situation, to get blood to your muscles and away from non-essential organs, to get your heart pumping faster and more air moving in and out of your lungs, so that you have as much focus and strength and ability to get away from that bear, or pick that toddler up and get them out of the road, or whatever your sympathetic situation might be. For the rest of this lesson, you might like to think, imagine some stressful situation, and such as, running from a bear in the woods, or rescuing someone from in front of a car, and think, well, okay, is this a sympathetic activity? The answer would be yes, only if it would actually help me get away from that bear, or get that person out from in front of the car. That said, the sympathetic nervous system does have a few homeostatic responses as well. For example, sympathetic nervous control is what keeps you from urinating most of the time, because you don't want to urinate while you're running from a bear in the woods. That comes into play lots of times when you're not under stress as well, when you're just bored and sitting in front of the television. You don't want to suddenly urinate there either. Okay, but for most things, the parasympathetic division is our homeostasis division. It's also been called the rest and digest division, because it promotes resting and replenishing our fuel and repairing our body, and it also promotes digesting our food. So I've also heard it called the rest and replenish division, or the rest and recuperate division, or the rest and repair division. There are all sorts of different things that the parasympathetic, different nicknames for it. But the main idea is that it's going to conserve energy and replenish energy when the body is at rest, and it's going to maintain homeostasis for most of your organs. It's going to make sure that your kidneys are doing their job to clean the blood, and that your organs are all getting a chance to rest, that your heart rate is steady and stable, and not too high. So throughout this presentation, we use green and blue to indicate the two different branches of the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system, though I think some of the slides switch the color coding, so be careful to notice which words are being used. The parasympathetic division here is shown in blue on this diagram, and its origins are in the brain stem, the cranial nerves, and in the very bottom of the spine, the sacrum. So taking the words cranial from cranial nerves and sacral from the sacral nerves, we get the other nickname for parasympathetic division, craniosacral. Okay, and I understand that there are a number of clinical resources out there, nursing textbooks, those sorts of things that refer to the craniosacral division of the nervous system instead of the parasympathetic. So that's a word you need to know. The other division, the sympathetic division, so the parasympathetic, we had the origins in the brainstem and down here in the sacrum. The sympathetic division, we have all of our pathways originate here in the thoracic and lumbar portions of the spine, though clearly they spread out quite a bit from there. But taking the words thoracic and lumbar and putting them together, using the letter O to join them like we did with joints and other and have with other compound words, we get thoracolumbar, which is kind of a cumbersome word to say, but again, there are a lot of clinical resources out there that will refer to the thoracolumbar division of the nervous system instead of calling it sympathetic, so you need to know that. The other important point about the difference between these two is that in the parasympathetic division, we always have one nerve going to a particular place, though this all-important vagus nerve here we'll talk about later goes to many different places at once. In the sympathetic nervous system, there is this thing called the sympathetic trunk or sympathetic chain that can take a single impulse and spread, a single concern that the body has and spread it all the way up and down the body, having impacts on multiple organs at the same time. You can imagine pretty quickly why that's important. If the sympathetic division, if the thoracolumbar division is our fight or flight response, we don't necessarily want to sit here turning on one organ at a time slowly over a period of a minute or two. We really want the whole system to come online at once and as quickly as possible. So spreading that signal up and down the body is an important thing to be able to do. Okay, one important note about autonomic nervous system wiring before we try to explain the wiring of the system. Whereas you remember that somatic motor pathways go straight from start to finish. Okay, if we were going to a skeletal muscle over here, we would be going through a single motor neuron here that goes in one straight efficient line from the spinal cord to the effector organ, the target organ, the muscle. Autonomic pathways are different. They have two axons. That bridge the gap from the spinal cord to the target organ. The first one, and then the two neurons meet at something called an autonomic ganglion. So the one before that is called preganglionic. The one after it is called postganglionic. So we have a preganglionic neuron with a preganglionic axon and a postganglionic neuron with a postganglionic axon. One important distinction to make is that the preganglionic is always myelinated, so it's the more efficient, high-speed connection. The postganglionic axon, for whatever reason, is unmyelinated, which means it's the slower, less high-speed transit of the two signals. What is different is how we put these two together. In the parasympathetic division, we have a long preganglionic axon, and the ganglion itself is either close to or even within the effector organ. And then we have a short, stubby postganglionic axon after that. In the sympathetic division, we have a short preganglionic axon with lots of branches, and each of those branches may go to a different autonomic ganglion, maybe even at a different level of the spinal cord, thanks to that sympathetic chain that spreads our signals up and down the sides of the vertebrae. That autonomic ganglion then feeds into a long postganglionic axon that more slowly spreads the signal down to the target organ, which would be somewhere over here. So now that we have those basic concepts, we can talk about the wiring of the two nervous systems. Parasympathetic, remember, is the craniosacral division, which means we start off in the cranium and the sacrum. The wiring is pretty straightforward, focused on organ by organ control. So we have one nerve that goes to the eye, we have one nerve that goes to the salivary glands, we have one nerve that goes all over the place that we'll mention in a minute, and then we have a nerve for the pelvic organs and a nerve for the genital organs here, and each organ has basically a single pathway to get to it from the craniosacral parts of the body. The parasympathetic nervous system uses the cranial nerves that you'll learn about when you study the brain. So the oculomotor nerve, the vagus nerve, and then it also uses what are called the pelvic splanchnic nerves from the sacral spine. Most abdominal organs are innervated by a single cranial nerve known as the vagus nerve. That's cranial nerve number 10. Okay, and it runs through a number of plexus pathways here known as the cardiac, pulmonary, and celiac plexuses, and through all of that networking that it spreads out into, that one vagus nerve manages to provide autonomic innervation to a whole host of abdominopelvic organs. The one exception to that are these the genital organs and the bladder down here, which get innervated by the pelvic splanchnic nerve. And with the exception of a couple of places in the head where you have ganglions outside the target organs, all of the ganglia from the parasympathetic nervous system are located here in the target organ. You can see those kind of embedded here in the target organ somewhere. Contrast that with the sympathetic division. Remember, that's our thoracolumbar division. And so all of our pathways begin in either the thoracic or the lumbar spine. The more complicated wiring of the sympathetic or thoracolumbar division is necessary to allow system-wide responses from some stimuli. Okay, sometimes you don't want a system-wide response. You just need to regulate your heart rate a little bit, or you need to turn your bladder off for a while. But sometimes you really are running from a threat or preparing to fight some sort of threat, and you do need an entire body reaction. And so the sympathetic nervous system is sort of cross-wired to allow that to happen. Except for the abdominopelvic organs, always the exception, except for the abdominopelvic organs, the ganglia from this system are here in the sympathetic chain, also known as the sympathetic trunk, and that allows those signals to spread up and down the body. Notice that we again have cardiac and pulmonary plexuses here that allow some crisscrossing of signals in that direction. We also have some splanchnic nerves in this part of the body. The abdominopelvic organs use the lumbar here, the thoracic. I'm sorry, I got those backwards. That would be the thoracic up here. These would be the lumbar down here, and these would be the sacral splanchnic nerves. One more note on wiring. The sympathetic nervous system has multiple routes to get you to the target organs. The most easy route is to synapse at the same level of the spinal cord in the sympathetic ganglion that's right next to that level of the spinal cord. The synapse may exit at the same level, or in another case here, it may exit at a different level from where you started. Another possibility is that one signal can actually be spread out to multiple levels of the sympathetic nervous system by going up and down that sympathetic chain, and that then sends our signal out to our target organ. A third option is that we can use the splanchnic nerves and a ganglion outside the sympathetic chain, so we can synapse at our ganglion there and then have a relatively short pathway to our target organ. And there's a fourth pathway that when the body decides that this is really a stress response that needs a whole body response to it, and that response needs to last longer than a single nerve stimulus, there are certain nerves that are pre-wired all the way to the adrenal medulla. Where's the second neuron here? Well, the second neuron is actually the adrenal medulla itself, which then spreads stress neurotransmitters into the blood and from there out to the entire body. And the punchline here, those stress neurotransmitters are epinephrine, what you commonly have probably heard of before as adrenaline. So one last note on wiring here. Who is it exactly that decides which portion of the sympathetic or the parasympathetic nervous system is going to be active at one time? One of the things you've probably noticed in thinking about the fight or flight versus rest or digest is that these two nervous systems can't be active at the same time on any particular organ. So, for example, a sympathetic response of the heart is to increase its heart rate. The parasympathetic response is to decrease its heart rate. We can't have both nerves going to the heart at the same time. We'd have a tug of war between those two responses. So somebody has to decide whether the sympathetic nervous system or the parasympathetic connection to a particular organ is going to be active at any given time. And the key decider, the commander-in-chief of this whole system, is the hypothalamus. This is the key body control center of the brain. And it uses either the sympathetic nervous system or the parasympathetic nervous system at any given time to balance some key variables like heart rate and blood pressure, body temperature, hydration, but also to respond to body needs, such as dealing with hunger. So if you're hungry, you obviously want to upregulate your digestive system. If you're in pain or stress or fear, however, those might lead more toward those fight or flight type responses. And any other strong emotion that comes in from the limbic system is going to influence that as well. If your limbic system is feeling happy and relaxed, that's going to put you in that rest or digest parasympathetic state. If the limbic system is feeling fearful or stressed or in some kind of emotional pain, it's going to put you in that sympathetic fight or flight mode, whether there's a real bear chasing you in the woods or not. Also tying into that, setting your emotional state to some extent is your cerebral cortex, that's the conscious part of your brain where you consciously relive memories, and reliving a memory of a stressful event can always bring up your body's stress responses. Your heart rate can increase. You can feel that sense of stress building even if you're standing in the middle of a bright green field, and the sudden, that memory of a horrible experience can bring that back. Desires can also affect this. If you're feeling hungry, that can upregulate your digestive system. If you're feeling sexual, that can upregulate your sexual systems. Also, there is some evidence in the literature of things called biofeedback, where you can consciously think about certain portions of your autonomic regulation, and just by thinking about it, you can bring your heart rate down. Just by thinking about it, you can keep your blood pressure in check. Your mileage may vary, but there's some indication that through the limbic system can influence the hypothalamus to reduce your stress level. But not every decision is made at the hypothalamus level. The hypothalamus obviously is going to influence the brainstem and the spinal cord, but sometimes they make their own decisions. Just as we saw muscles moving due to reflexes in the spinal cord when we studied the somatic motor system, there are autonomic reflexes that regulate things. So you can reflexively regulate heart rate, blood pressure, air going to your lungs, movement and secretion in your GI tract, and of course, responses to light and what you're looking at will regulate your eye focus and your eye dilation. In the spinal cord, there are reflexes that control urination and defecation responses, so you can obviously consciously override those, at least once you're over 3 years old or so. You can consciously override your urination and defecation responses, but ultimately they are reflexes. And the entire sexual response cycle, from arousal to climax to resolution after that, is maintained by a series of spinal cord reflexes. Again, your cerebral cortex, your limbic system, your hypothalamus can all influence those, but ultimately it comes down to a series of reflexes. Okay, shifting gears from anatomy to physiology, what neurotransmitter do motor neurons use? You may remember from our previous chapters on the muscles that all somatic motor neurons use the same neurotransmitter, which is called acetylcholine, abbreviated capital A, capital C, lowercase h. So what about autonomic motor neurons? Why don't they use acetylcholine too? Well, they can, and it turns out that half of them do. But just as we need two different divisions of the parasympathetic nervous system or of the autonomic nervous system, one parasympathetic to downregulate, one sympathetic to upregulate, or vice versa, we need two neurotransmitters, one of which will turn on a particular organ and one of which will turn it down. So the other neurotransmitter is one called norepinephrine, sometimes abbreviated capital N, capital E, like northeast. So norepinephrine is a slightly different version of a molecule called epinephrine. Epinephrine is named because it comes from the gland on top of the kidney, epinephros, which is more commonly called the adrenal gland. So an alternative set of names for these molecules, epinephrine and norepinephrine, is adrenaline and noradrenaline. Most people know them by those names because, how often have you gone to a roller coaster and said, wow, I got a big adrenaline rush? So now that you know the proper names, you're supposed to go to the roller coaster and say, wow, I got an epinephrine rush, and see if your friends get it. Okay, so now we can put this together and say The parasympathetic pathway, we start in the central nervous system, perhaps in the spinal cord or the brain stem, and we travel out along a preganglionic fiber to a synapse here at the autonomic ganglion in the embedded in the organ that we're talking to, and then we have a second neuron, a postganglionic neuron that goes a short distance into that organ and releases neurotransmitter there to finally, get the smooth muscle in this case to do something. And in both cases, when we're talking about the parasympathetic nervous system, it's going to use acetylcholine for both of those connections. In a sympathetic pathway, again, we start here in the spinal cord and we travel along the pathways, along the various branches, and one of them hits this particular synapse in the autonomic ganglion, and which is not in the target organ this time. It's next to the spinal cord, or it's somewhere in the abdomen. And then we have a postganglionic fiber that spreads out to various parts of our target organ and releases a final neurotransmitter there. Now here's where the difference comes in. The first neurotransmitter is still acetylcholine, because why not? But the second neurotransmitter is usually norepinephrine. So the sympathetic nervous system almost always uses norepinephrine as its final neurotransmitter. So norepinephrine is going to have the fight or flight effects on the body, and acetylcholine as a final neurotransmitter is going to have the rest or digest effects on the body. So here's all of that information in one summary figure. As we learned in the somatic nervous system, about the somatic nervous system in the muscular chapter and the spinal nerve chapter, we have one heavily myelinated axon that goes all the way to the target organ, releases acetylcholine, and is always stimulatory. In the parasympathetic, it looks very similar. We've got one lightly myelinated axon that goes almost all the way to the target organ, synapses at a ganglion, a short postganglionic neuron, and once again we dump acetylcholine onto the organ, and it's either stimulatory or inhibitory depending on whether that target organ is excited by acetylcholine or downregulated by it. The sympathetic is probably the most unusual one here, in that we start in the spinal cord again. We send out a short, lightly myelinated preganglionic axon. We synapse at a sympathetic ganglion. We spread out to our target organs, and there we dump norepinephrine instead of acetylcholine. And this is going to have the opposite effect of acetylcholine. It's either going to, if acetylcholine stimulates that organ, norepinephrine will inhibit it. If acetylcholine inhibits the organ, norepinephrine will stimulate it. And sympathetic also has this body-wide option where it can go to the acetylcholine, release to the adrenal medulla, release its acetylcholine, and the adrenal medulla will flood the blood with epi and norepi, with epinephrine and norepinephrine, and that will go all over the body and have a systemic response for quite a bit longer than the nervous system could sustain a response. So it gets a bigger and a longer response that way. Here's a point-by-point comparison of the two that you might want to think about studying. The fight or flight versus rest and the fight or flight versus rest and digest, the thoracolumbar versus craniosacral, the sympathetic trunk of ganglia versus the ganglia in the target organ, the always using acetylcholine versus some, mostly using norepinephrine, and the fact that parasympathetic is going to be a local response. Sympathetic can be local, but it's also capable of a full body response. I have a couple of tables here that you can study. There's probably a similar set of tables in your textbook that detail the effects of the different organs on the body. It's worth noting that in almost every case, the effect of the parasympathetic is pretty much the opposite of the sympathetic, that if we increase motility here, we're going to decrease it over here. If we're going to contract the smooth muscle of the bladder wall, we're going to relax the smooth muscle of the bladder wall over here. The only exception to that is in the sexual organs, where parasympathetic, for example, in the penis causes erection and sympathetic causes ejaculation. That's not the opposite. It's, in fact, one has to come after the other. So this is the only place in the body where the parasympathetic and sympathetic are not antagonists. They are, in fact, synergists. They have to work together. The parasympathetic has to start things up, and then it has to pass control over to the sympathetic to finish things off. And that's how, in a nutshell, sex works in the autonomic nervous system. And finally, I want to leave you with this one last slide. This slide has blanks and things to circle for each of the various organs that respond to the sympathetic versus the parasympathetic nervous system. You'll notice there are slightly more organs that respond to the sympathetic nervous system than organs that respond to parasympathetic. Look at this, see if you can figure out what goes in the blanks, because I'm going to put this up on the board when we get back to class, and it will be your job to figure out what goes in the blanks. Thank you for watching this presentation. I hope you enjoyed it, and have a good day.